Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight on our Scrutiny Panel Scrutiny Panel 1, Housing and Environment. Tonight is our second meeting, and we will be looking at temporary accommodation in Ealing. I have received, in terms of apologies for absence, I've received apologies from Councillor Alexandra, and has anybody else received any other apologies? Councillor Sidiou has sent her apologies, but she is also being substituted by Councillor Mortaza. Thank you. Just to let everybody know that this is being live streamed on YouTube, and we have panel members that may be joining us online, and I believe an officer is also online. So if you do want to speak, please use the raise hand sign so that we can see. Right, urgent matters. I've not been notified of any urgent matters to look at. Declaration of interest. Yes, Councillor Hart.
Yes. Yeah, bearing in mind that we're talking about housing and particularly around the rental issue, I've got a property business within the borough.
Thank you. And Councillor Taylor?
Because I work for another local authority.
Thank you. And Ben, please.
Thank you. I'm Ben Zimi. I'm the Chief Executive of Generation Rent. So we have an interest in campaigning for private renters across the UK.
Fantastic. And I expected all of you guys to say it. So thank you so much. Any matters to be considered in private? I have not been notified of any. No. Minutes of the last meeting. Do we agree the minutes of the meeting that was held on the 26th of June? Is that agreed? Thank you. Right, and we move on to the agenda item for tonight. We are joined by Stephen Tate, who is the Assistant Director for Housing Demand, Mitchell Powell, and he is the Head of Housing Allocations and Accommodation, Councillor Louise Brett, Cabinet Member for Affordable Homes, and we are joined online by Sam Ashton, who is a Policy Officer at London Councils. I believe, Sam, you will be starting off the presentation tonight, because I'm obviously conscious that you've joined us and you've given us your time to be here, but and I don't want to keep you for too long, so you can present, and then panel members will ask you questions and you will be free to go. I'm not going to ask you to stay for the rest of the meeting, and yeah, so floor's yours if you want to share your slides.
Yes, that's great. Can you see these? Sorry, the problem with presenting is I can't see whether you can see these.
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Okay, so my name's Sam Ashton. I work at London Councils, which is the membership body for London's 32 boroughs and the City of London. Where I work in the housing and planning team, and I'm the policy lead for temporary accommodation and statutory homelessness. So just to set off your panel hearing this evening, I'm going to give a bit of context and data about the broader homelessness and temporary accommodation crisis in London. So as you can see, we're starting off with some news coverage of our analysis across London, showing that London is facing the most severe homelessness crisis in its history. We estimate that now 1 in 50 Londoners are homeless and resident in temporary accommodation. For children, that's 1 in 21 children in the capital are homeless and residing in temporary accommodation, which equates on average to 1 child in every classroom in London, which really does put the scale and depth of the crisis into context when you consider it that way. So we can see here that the how the crisis has increased. The bottom right-hand graph shows you the total number of temporary accommodation households in London from 2011 to 2024, and how that has risen. That's particularly evidenced in the increase in the number of households who've had to live in bed and breakfast. Which is a bit of a misnomer. Bed and breakfast just is a data collection term for non-self-contained accommodation. So that could include a range of accommodation types, including commercial hotels, where the household doesn't have access to their own cooking facilities or bathrooms. So any accommodation with shared facilities, effectively. And the number of homeless families living in such accommodation rose 495% between June 2020 and June 2024. And as of March this year, there are still 1,290 London families living in this kind of accommodation for more than 6 weeks, which is the supposed legal limit for such accommodation types, and that compares to 50 such families in that situation in March 2022. So what's driving this crisis? It's really a perfect storm of different factors. There's an imbalance between demand, that's housing need, and the supply of affordable accommodation in London. Most recently, over the last couple of years, we've seen a significant reduction in the supply of private rented sector properties. This has been combined with increasingly insufficient welfare support, and creates a situation where there's a shortage of housing that is affordable to residents. So some figures just to put that into context. Research commissioned by London councils and carried out by Savills showed that private rented sector lettings were down 41% in London compared to the pre-pandemic quarterly average. And this is equated to a net loss of 45,000 properties from the market across London, which is largely concentrated at the bottom end of the market, so the properties that are most affordable to lower income households, at the same time that rents have increased by 20%. So this has led to a situation combined with the LHA freeze, where in 2024 only 5% of PRS properties available in London were affordable on local housing allowance rates, which is the amount of universal credit that's available for housing costs. And LHA has obviously been frozen since 2024. This is a direct impact on boroughs' ability to prevent homelessness, and as well as to secure PRS homes to move people out of temporary accommodation. For benefit cap families with 2 or more children, there are no areas of London where a rent at LHA level is covered within the universal credit entitlement. And of course, councils are required to find affordable homes to end a homelessness duty. So for those households, it's simply not possible to find affordable PRS accommodation in London to move them out of temporary accommodation. Housing benefit rates for households in temporary accommodation has been frozen since 2011, and councils have to pay this shortfall themselves, which is one of the key drivers of the growing financial cost of temporary accommodation to local authorities. Adding to all of this has been increased competition from the Home Office for accommodation, who increased the number of asylum seekers accommodated in London by 342% between 2020 and 2023, which has led to a driving up of costs of accommodation. And in many cases, we hear from our members that the Home Office are outpricing them, outcompeting them, as they're prepared to pay more for accommodation than boroughs can afford. Of course, this is just set to get worse with the closing of asylum hotels, and competition for accommodation in London will increase further. There's over 336,000 households on waiting lists for social housing in London. The government has, of course, committed to providing more social and affordable homes, including a historic increase in the Affordable Homes Programme, which is greatly welcome by all London boroughs, but we know it will take time to deliver these households. So the end situation is that the rising cost of managing homelessness is now the single biggest threat to the financial security of London boroughs, and we estimate that London boroughs are now spending up to £4 million a day on temporary accommodation. So this graph just illustrates the earlier point on local housing allowance affordability and shows you how it's changed over time. The bars are for different bedroom sizes, but as you can see, that for all bedroom sizes, it's far below the 30% of the market that is meant to be affordable. The black figures gives you the total across the different bedroom sizes. So you can see that when LHA was first increased in 2020, after a 4-year freeze, this rose to 21% of the market being affordable to those on reliant on benefits to pay their housing costs. And over the years, this has reduced down to 5% in 2024. So a significant reduction in the affordability of private rented properties to households reliant on benefits. This has had a significant impact on council finances. Here we can see how the rising cost of homelessness and temporary accommodation has meant that housing and temporary accommodation budgets are consistently the most overspent compared to adult social care, children's social care, and other service types, with an estimated 327 million overspend on temporary accommodation in the previous financial year of 2024-2025, significantly increasing on previous years. So I thought I would talk a bit about the context of what's happening in homelessness in London, but also perhaps highlight some of the solutions that we're pursuing at a pan-London level, so that this presentation isn't all doom and gloom. So I'm just going to introduce briefly the work we're doing across London on the London Ending Homelessness Accelerator programme, which is a joint programme between London Councils, the Greater London Authority, and the London Housing Directors Group, and we're supported by the Centre of Homelessness Impact, aiming to accelerate efforts to end homelessness in London. We think this programme can be a central part of the government's delivery of a national homelessness strategy. We're ending the design phase of the programme, through which we've engaged with London Government and wider stakeholders to identify the factors that we think are driving homelessness in the capital, alongside the barriers to prevention. And through this process, we've identified the systemic challenges that we think needs addressing and the accompanying policy solutions. So based on this, we're proposing the following priorities to prevent Londoners from becoming homeless and reducing the use of temporary accommodation, including ending the usage of B&Bs in London, to prevent and end rough sleeping in London by 2030. Providing temporary accommodation offers the best value for money and outcomes for all residents, and securing sustainable accommodation supported housing who needs it most. The programme is developing draft action plans for these different priority areas as appropriate, and the Mayor's Rough Sleeping Plan of Action, which was published earlier this year, is the first of these, and obviously relates to the priority around preventing and ending rough sleeping in London by 2030. We think that this will collectively create a significant contribution to reducing homelessness in London. We think that the crisis demands comprehensive solutions, combining resources and working together more effectively as a citywide system, and boroughs are ready to lead this transformative programme. But that alone isn't sufficient, and we're hoping to see the following national policy changes to help deliver real change that London councils have been lobbying for, and pressing the government to be included in its forthcoming cross-departmental homelessness strategy. So chief among them are removing the January 2011 cap on LHA payable for temporary accommodation through the subsidy regimes, The current system is destabilising to council finances and drives a crisis footing to homelessness activity, leading to worse outcomes for residents who are at risk of homelessness. And it kind of creates this situation where all of council resources tend to be focused on managing the temporary accommodation crisis, and we don't have the time or the resources available for proper homelessness prevention, which of course is an essential part to getting a better hold on the crisis. We want to see local housing allowance uprated to the 30% of market rates, rents, and tied to future increases in CPI, which would help provide a certainty of future income that can support investment in temporary accommodation, in particular crowding in institutional investment. We know from talking to boroughs that acquisitions of temporary accommodation isn't going to be an important part of the solution, but oftentimes the financial models for those don't add up because of the uncertainty over future income from local housing allowance rates. We want to see an increase in homelessness prevention grant funding to provide more resourcing for prevention. And we want the government to join a joined-up approach to procuring accommodation that prevents price escalation in the capital. So we're seeking particularly the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice to join the existing interborough accommodation agreement, which sets the maximum rates that should be paid for procuring accommodation in London, so that central government and local government are working together to ensure that we're not outbidding each other and further escalating the market in London. We want to maximise the opportunities presented by this reduction in the PRS by initiating a huge increase in local authority housing acquisitions programme, including the government investing more in models such as the Local Authority Housing Fund, as well as we want to see the government working with councils on possible models for institutional investment, some of which may require underwriting of the risk given the potential of scale of investment needed in new housing supply, including the supply of temporary accommodation. So that is the end of my presentation. I will stop sharing my screen and will share the slides, but I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you very much for that presentation. And I guess seeing the numbers just shows the reality of the crisis that we're in. And I guess it's not just Ealing or West London that is just under pressure, but it's across London. And to be honest, I wasn't expecting to see those numbers, but that 56% of TA placement nationally is from London boroughs, and that's a huge number. But I guess the positives, as you mentioned, would be yes, there are financial impact, but it's encouraging that the government is acknowledging that and somewhat trying to fill the gaps with in different ways. Are there any questions from panel members? Councillor Taylor, Councillor Summers. Okay, Councillor Taylor, please.
Yeah, just a couple of quick questions, Sam. One, on the £4 million a day net cost, is that a net cost, sorry, or is that overall spend by local authorities? And the second one is on the IBAA. I know you've mentioned the Home Office on there. Where are we with boroughs? Are all boroughs abiding by those agreements as well?
So on the first question, the 4 million a day is a gross cost figure, I believe. So that's not net of funding received back from the government, although we have commissioned the London School of Economics to do a piece of research about the impact of the rules around housing benefit subsidy for temporary accommodation, which we expect to be published in a couple of weeks. So that will estimate the kind of net cost to London boroughs of temporary accommodation. So I'm happy to share that with the committee when that's published. On the second question about the interborough accommodation agreement, I think it's fair to say that in the context of kind of a reducing affordability in the market, reducing availability, and increased demand, boroughs have started to pay more and more for temporary accommodation, and adherence to the agreement has lessened over the past couple of years. However, we do have a programme of work to renew the IBAA. So the IBA team has commissioned an independent advisor to look at resetting the rates closer to reflect the actual market cost of temporary accommodation at the moment. And there will be a new memorandum of understanding for the agreement that will go to borough leaders later this year, seeking kind of a renewed agreement to stick to those rates, because that's what we hear, you know, very firmly from politicians across London, is that there is a desire to get back to a position of boroughs working together and not competing or outbidding each other. So yes, the agreement has reduced in its effectiveness in recent years, but there's a plan to get it back to where it was.
Thank you. I have a question myself, and then we go on to Councillor Summers. So my question is, in terms of the changes to the London government funding formula that is going to be announced, it's still in the making, we don't have the figures. How will this affect local authorities? And I think we're hoping that Ealing will be one of the beneficiaries, but this is yet to be confirmed, or, you know, still in the pipeline, I guess. But what do you expect the impact to be on negatively impacted London boroughs and their housing position? And I guess the second part of my question would be for our officers in the room. On a micro level, what might we expect to see happening in Ealing with the funding formula changes?
So I think I'm not in a position to comment on what we expect the funding to change for Ealing in particular. I think the homelessness funding landscape is very complicated, and we could probably spend the rest of this meeting talking about it. In effect, MHCOG are proposing to merge all the funding streams for homelessness into a single grant. So that's putting together the rough sleeping funding together with the homelessness prevention grant. However, the portion of that grant that is available to spend on temporary accommodation is going to be moved into the revenue support grant. However, it will be unring funded, and there won't be kind of a given line for that funding amount. We think from our modelling that this is actually going to increase the amount of funding for temporary accommodation that boroughs receive, but because the wider fair funding changes are going to drastically, you know, alter funding amounts, particularly for inner and central London boroughs, it may not feel like an increase in funding. And I think because there are so many moving parts, it's hard to say what the end outcome would be. I think, well, you know, generally the position of local authorities and boroughs is to support, you know, greater freedoms in the allocation of their funding and their funds. We think that the key question when it comes to funding for temporary accommodation is that there needs to be a demand-led funding mechanism that you know, boroughs don't have the control over the amount of people that come into temporary accommodation. It's a statutory duty. They have to house people who are eligible at their door, and that funding should be covered through that cost should be covered through the welfare system, which is why we think you know, addressing the shortfall in that by removing the cap on the amount of housing benefit subsidy payable for households in temporary accommodation is our key ask when it comes to reforming homelessness funding.
Thank you. Councillor Summers.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for your presentation. I've got two questions. One is your sort of little manifesto for what would how could things change. Obviously, it depends on government policy changes. were they to do that tomorrow, I just wondered how quickly that would improve the situation, or is it sort of are they fairly sort of medium term change? Would the impact quite medium term? And also you mentioned the it's obviously a bit of a zeitgeist at the moment, the impact of asylum seekers in hotels, and how that's you mentioned that as something that is adding to the the use of the stock. Is there any reason why the Home Office uses hotels in London, or is it just because considering that the homeless crisis in London, you would have thought that doesn't make a lot of sense, but because asylum seekers can go anywhere really. But that sounds a bit NIMBYist, but I just wondered if you had any ideas of government policy on that and how it might affect the situation.
Sorry, I just want to say one thing about in terms of government policy and how they choose asylum hotels. I don't think Sam would know the answer to that because it's government policy, and I think it would be inappropriate for him to to get him to answer that question. But the other part of the question you can answer.
Yeah, I think it's true that asylum policy is not my area of expertise, and I'll have to defer to my colleagues here to get you an answer on that question and as to why and how decisions are made on where asylum seekers are accommodated. I think our the policy position that we're pursuing is not to argue about how and where they're accommodated, but that the government shouldn't be out competing boroughs, shouldn't be offering to pay more for accommodation than boroughs in order to have a fair and level playing field. Because the problem is it leads to price escalation. And we know, of course, that actually from what boroughs tell us that many of the providers of temporary accommodation are very kind of canny at trying to get the highest price for their accommodation. They'll come back to Ealing and say, for example, oh, the Home Office are willing to pay 20% more than you for this property, so why don't you pay that? And really we want to get to a situation where that kind of outmaneuvering of the public purse isn't possible, and that the Home Office, Ministry of Justice, of course, too, because there's probation, accommodation, and boroughs are all working together in order to get the best value for the public person and not overpay for accommodation.
Thank you. I am conscious of time, so Ben, if you would like to ask the final question, please.
Sorry, I didn't actually get an answer to the other bit of the question.
The other bit of the question, which was
sorry, about the how quickly your sort of suggestions would make a difference.
Yes, apologies, I forgot about the first question. I think some of them would be instantaneous. So, for example, raising local housing allowance rates would instantly boost the amount of the private rented sector that's affordable to households on low income, which I think would make it easier to prevent homelessness, but also find affordable properties to discharge duty into and move households out of temporary accommodation. Many of the other measures, I think the other measure on addressing the housing benefit subsidy shortfall would put a stop to the unsustainable financial pressures on local authorities and immediately free up income and resources that could be focused elsewhere, which are currently dedicated to just plugging that financial gap. I think the other measures, particularly around acquisitions and increasing the supply of temporary accommodation, would take more time. So they're probably more medium term things, but nevertheless quicker than increasing the supply of affordable social housing overall, which I think everyone agrees is the key solution to this problem, but necessarily one that takes time.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks very much, Chair. I just want to add on the local housing allowance point, it's worth understanding that when we talk about the 30th percentile, and that was reset in April 2024, that's based on 6 months to 18 months before that date. So we actually could have the most affordable homes up to 30% based on October 2022. And you've seen how much rents have risen in London since then. So that's why it's such a big problem to cover that. My question, though, for Sam, thank you so much for the presentation, is about the institutional investment. And you talked about the plan, the policy idea of underwriting risk potentially. I just want to understand a bit more about what that would involve. And does that mean giving institutional investors all of the rewards and none of the risk? And is that a good situation for the council to be in?
I think it's a balancing act, right? You know, institutional investors at the end of the day, you know, are seeking to make a profit, and they need to be able to make something of a profit in order to encourage to invest in this as an avenue. At the moment, we just hear reports, you know, from boroughs who spend a long time negotiating over deals that everyone wants to see come through to the end, but just simply can't add up because the risk transferred to the borough is too great, or you know, because of things like the not having confidence about how local housing allowance rates will increase in the future. So I think that there needs to be kind of a sharing of risk and apportioning of risk, and if there's space for the government to step in to underwrite some of that risk as a way of unlocking these deals to move forward, particularly the risk that would or at the moment that investors are proposing falls to the boroughs. If that risk could be, which boroughs you know, rightly are not prepared to take such significant financial risk, if that could be underwritten by the central government, for example, as a way of unlocking that investment, that's the policy idea that we're pursuing. I hope that makes sense.
It does. Thank you. I guess there are no more, no more questions from us, but it was very insightful to obviously, it's helpful for us to get a better understanding of the overall picture, because obviously we know what is going on in Ealing, but to see the bigger picture that is everywhere, it's very helpful for us. And I would definitely like to take you up on your offer that you said that you'll share the report once it's available with the committee, and I'm sure everybody would be very happy to see that report. So if you could please share that with us. And yeah, I won't take up any more of your time tonight. So thank you so much for being here and presenting. And yeah, thank you very much. You're free to
Thank you
leave
for
now.
having me. I hope the rest of your meeting is productive.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Perfect. Okay, we will move on to the main agenda item, I guess. And there aren't any presentations, I believe. So we will just talk about the report that I'm sure panel members have read through. No, I definitely don't have 7 pages of questions, but you know, we'll get through it. It's absolutely fine. But if you just want to start off, and then yeah, we can come in and ask questions.
Thank you very much, Chair. So I think Sam's done a really good job for us, actually, in terms of setting out the context, the wider context in which we sit. And the report you've got before you today sets out where we are in terms of our journey. And it's a move on from the last time we came here a year ago to talk about where we were and what we needed to do. I suppose it'd be quite just worthwhile talking about some key statistics from an Ealing perspective to try and put some of this into context. So around 1 in 42 households in the borough are either homeless or threatened with homeless, which is an increase of about 21% from about 2 years ago. We were 4th highest in terms of levels of rough sleeping within London. The last rough sleeping count has seen us come down in terms of that number. We're the 4th highest in terms of level of repossessions. We lost almost 10,000 social rented homes through the Right to Buy scheme since 1980. We have the 10th highest proportion of households in temporary accommodation, and we did have the second highest usage of bed and breakfast in England, and that's dropped considerably over the last 6 to 9 months. I think our big challenge is about rent and the costs within Ealing, both in terms of trying to purchase and also in terms of rent. So, for example, Southall rents, which is some of the lowest private sector rents we've got within the borough, increased by more than 90% between 2010 and 2022. At the end of last financial year, we had approximately 2,800 people in temporary accommodation, and that had increased considerably over the COVID period through to last year. And to just put the finances into a little bit of context, so Sam was talking about subsidy loss, part of our challenge. So the difference between LHA 2011 and the rents that we have to pay, and that's the bit that the local authority needs to pick up. So our subsidy loss for 2024-25 was about 22.4 million. That's predicted to be closer to 28 to 30 million this financial year. The last 2 financial years, we overspent our temporary accommodation budget, 4 million odd in 2 years ago. Last year, about 15 million. So a lot of our work is around trying to bring stability and trying to bring down the costs whilst at the same time trying to improve services to our households in temporary accommodation and ultimately find them the best solution, which is about settled accommodation, that's into permanent accommodation that they manage themselves. I'll leave it there and pass it across for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the room? Because I can definitely start and then you guys can join. One thing that really sticks out for me, Ealing, second highest in the country. Is that a raw number or is that a proportionate number? Because that will obviously make a big difference in terms of where we are. So what does that second highest mean?
It means exactly that. So I think Birmingham was the only other council that had more people in bed and breakfast than we did in Ealing. So we were quite a sore thumb when you compared us to the rest of London. So we peaked at 700 odd people in bed and breakfast at one stage. That is now reduced all the way down to, I think it's 105 families in non-compliant bed and breakfast.
Okay. Ben, you had a question.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I've got a few actually, but I'll go around. I think I'll do one at a time and let others speak. Could I just start with the children in bed and breakfast at the moment? So there's been a reduction, which is fantastic news, but obviously there's still a few hundred children in B&B for more than 6 weeks at the moment. That dropped by 44, I think, over the last year, is what the table says. To get that down to 0 at that rate would take over 6 years to do that. Do you think that's realistic, or do you have plans to move that forward and basically stop any child being in B&Bs for more than 6 weeks earlier than 2032? Thank you.
So as an authority, we have a number of step-down programs working alongside one another. And we have also been told by MHCLG that by the end of this calendar year, all families over 6 weeks in non-compliant, we need to move on into alternative accommodation. So by the end, so that's what we're working towards. That's what we're gearing up to. The reality is we still will be needing to place families with children into B&B, but then moving forward, the idea will be that will be the first step in the family's journey or the household's journey in temporary accommodation, that they'll be in there for less than 6 weeks, and then they progress on into other alternative temporary accommodation.
Can I just follow up? So the alternative accommodation that you're finding for these families, there's obviously a lot of families that you're working with this year. What would that look like? And is that a sustainable place for them to be while you're looking to find something more permanent?
To answer the latter part, is it more sustainable? Yes, it's certainly more sustainable than a non-compliant B&B. We are looking at moving into some into leased a bed and breakfast accommodation that we have, which then means that it's exempt from the 6-week rule, and there's facilities for households to use. We're also looking into more leased accommodation as well for families to move into, but also an increase in the number moving forward to, in terms of settled accommodation that's being offered. So it'd be a combination.
Sorry, just one more if that's okay. If it's leased and still a B&B, is there any difference in the experience that the family will have with being more than 6 weeks in a leased B&B compared to a B&B at the moment?
To the extent where they'll be able to at least have their own cooking facilities, washing facilities, rather than, you know, a B&B in the strict sense where, you know, you wouldn't have access to those types of facilities. And they, you know, they are close, but they are more managed by the staff as well, and more oversight.
It's probably just worth picking up here that any form of temporary accommodation is not really suitable for anyone for a long period of time. And what we really need to be doing is trying to find sustainable accommodation that the households can manage themselves. As part of the pack here, you can see there's a property strategy. And the idea of the property strategy is to try and take us out of where we were, which was in crisis, into a more managed situation. So what we're trying to do is move ourselves from a position where we have many families sitting in bed and breakfast to either leased accommodation, then moving from that leased accommodation then into using hostels, or to try and get a private rented sector through our either nightly products or lease products into our own type of accommodation, working with registered providers, as well as thinking about other property supplies that we can bring on. What we're trying to do is we're trying to make the time that a household will spend with us in temporary accommodation the best we possibly can. But ultimately, we've got to try and get them out of temporary accommodation to settled accommodation.
Thank you. I have a question which kind of fits into what Ben was saying. So in terms of the 105 households that we have in non-compliant B&Bs, are we paying them a daily living cost? Because some of these B&Bs, there is no cooking facilities or whatever. So how do we expect them to, you know, what are we doing with, how are we helping them?
We're not paying a daily cost at all, and that's the reason why we want to move people out of that type of accommodation into. So we talked about leased bed and breakfast accommodation. Why is that better than bed and breakfast? You have your own cooking facilities, you have your own eating room, you have a place where you can store your food, you have a fridge, you have some communal space as well. So that's much better than being confined to bed and breakfast. You're not in a situation where you have to leave your bed and breakfast at a particular moment of time, then have to come back at a certain moment of time. So what we're trying to do is move as many of those out as fast as we possibly can into better forms of accommodation, and then on from those type of accommodation to other types of accommodation.
But we still have 105 families that are in these non-compliant bed and breakfast, and obviously they have their own personal costs on top of, we expect them to feed themselves like 3 times a day, because the council is ultimately failing them by providing the basics, washing facilities, cooking facilities and things like that. So it's very and in my day job, you know, I hear a lot of people that are in these non-compliant accommodations saying that the management of these B&Bs ask them to leave at 10 a.m. and they can only come back at 6 p.m. And this isn't just the emergency ones where they have to present the next day at the council. This is when they are told to stay there they might be there for 6 weeks or so, but then they have to go and sit in McDonald's or wherever from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. so that they can go back and have somewhere to stay again. So there definitely is something that we urgently need to do for those people that are over the 6 weeks at least, which is, we've already established is 105 families. So
you're right. That type of accommodation isn't suitable. We know that it affects families' lives, and that's why we need to try and move them out as fast as we possibly can. We are working more with public health and through public health, trying to make sure we join up some of the health consequences. We've got some additional funding from MHCLG in terms of how we can support children within bed and breakfast. All of these measures come together to try and alleviate the situation that the people are in, but ultimately we shouldn't have those people in bed and breakfast for more than 6 weeks, and we've got to work really hard to try and move them from those into different types of accommodation. And that's where our real energy and focus has been over the last 6 months, and that's what we will continue to work on.
That's kind of reassuring to know that different areas come together to help. I've got one more question, and then Councillor Crawford, you have a question as well. So in terms of moving families out, I know that we tend to, make an offer, and a suitable offer, and if they take or not, and sometimes that can be out of borough. Now, do we have any incentive program for families to take up offers outside of the borough to make it more attractive, to say, because realistically we don't have enough properties within the borough for everybody to want to stay? So
so we have the incentive in the sense of we'll pay rent advance and deposit to the landlord, and I think I'm right in saying that if the household then moves on from that private rented sector, they take the deposit with them. It's not returned to the authority.
It's not returned.
No. So but it's about those funds. Yeah. So if they choose to move up to alternative accommodation, they have those funds there.
do we offer help with removal costs and stuff like that? If, for example, if they're moving to Durham, let's say.
Yeah.
So okay. Councillor Crawford. Mike, please. If we can keep them.
Okay, thank you. The leased hostels, where I'm referring to 3.12, when you talk about the service needs to broaden its horizons on the type of housing that is available. I'm assuming that one of these is the leased accommodation that you're talking about. So will you be in a position to provide this in Ealing, or would it be elsewhere? The other thing, the other point is 5.4, bringing back mitigation programme, bringing back into use properties earmarked for regeneration. If that is a possibility, I would have thought that no one is living there anymore. They've been decanted. If they've been decanted, that means it's going to be massive mould. The resources needed to bring it up. I'm thinking of a block of flats to address the roof, the plumbing, the mould and damp. I think that's a great idea. It's a pity. I mean, maybe some of the residents who were there before might have wanted that to have happened before, so they didn't have to move. But I think that's great. But do we have the funds to do it? And the third point is, what's the policy with children? With my experience, a few years ago, I had a few pieces of casework, and I found the officers really good at doing their best for young people who were to sit exams, preparing, for their GCSEs and A levels. So, what support are you in a position to? And just finally, I would like to say a big thank you to all those officers that actually have to deal with, vulnerable people every single day, and they come across as being rather hard and whatever. But I hope there is that recognition that it is difficult, and there is that support, and in some cases, some really good therapeutic programs. But it's really important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me take your questions then in order. So the first part was around the paragraph in 3.12. So this relates to our property strategy, and I think part of the challenge that we've had is that we've become very reliant upon the private sector. So in terms of our PSLs, our private lease units, and our LIAs, which are our nightly units, that in itself has driven our cost effectively, because we've had approximately 1,600 units sitting within that portfolio. What we need to do is diversify. And that means that we have a number of different products for different types of situations in different locations. And I think it's what we need to do is make sure we have all those locations covered. So there will be some within Ealing. The people will have to stay within Ealing because they might have a connection because of education, for example. However, there will be some people who, through conversations, it's better they're able to move further away. So that's the first part around diversification. The next bit on the regen properties. So we've got a number of regen projects that still need to go ahead, but are stalled at the moment. So the funding doesn't exist. So rather than have those properties sat there empty, there is a business case effectively to be made around what's the cost of keeping someone in temporary accommodation in a nightly product, which can run to 30, 40, 50,000 pounds per year, as opposed to keeping them within one of our regen properties for a limited period of time. And you're right, there will need to be some investment to make sure that those properties are brought up to a standard that is right. But it makes sense to do that. At the end of the day, an evaluation needs to be made on those regeneration properties because they will go back into a regeneration pot. And because it is temporary accommodation, it becomes easier to a certain extent to be able to move people on when the time is right to do that. It also makes a little bit of sense, doesn't it, in terms of those estates, because when you have estates that are occupied and you have people around, they start to police themselves, don't they, to an extent as well. Then, do you want to pick up the question around policy on children?
Yeah, sure. So just to pick up on the point around what support do we provide for children and young people that are going through like key stages in education. We pick that up as part of the suitability assessment when determining where to place and offer a household. So, for example, if a household consists of children who are going through, year 6 SATs, year 11 A levels, then we try as hard as we can to ensure that we find accommodation within the statutory timeframes of travel to those schools to ensure that children can still access education.
Just that.
Make it short, please.
So the other thing, of course, is when a child is awaiting an assessment and working partnership with education, maybe they can be brought forward. But what do you do when there is a child? I mean, it could be quite a serious issue, because if they're being moved out of the borough, and we probably don't know whether there'll have to be another assessment in that borough or if it's in another part of the country. So what do you do? What's the policy with regard to special needs?
So if a child has additional needs and, for example, has an education, health and care plan, then again, the EHCP will form part of the suitability assessment. And we will therefore try to secure accommodation to ensure that the child can access education. If it's around assessment of need, coming up to an assessment for an EHCP, I've been here since June and I haven't seen any policy around that. But the way I would like it to work is that my officers liaise with the education team here to see whether or not there's anything we could do in the receiving borough, and that's how other London boroughs will operate. In that, you'd have sort of cross-party, cross-borough working, and that's how I would like to see work moving forward.
We have had examples where we've moved families to other parts of the country, and we've had a conversation between our education department and their education department to make sure the notes are handed across, and we try and do that in a seamless way.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for the report, and I whizzed through quickly. There are a couple of points which I would like to have. I mean, I didn't understand, and I would like to have some clarifications. Which one is that what are the statutory tests and what is the requirements for that? And also, I understand a lot of goes on into reducing pressure on the services, but are there any preventative measures which are there in place to prevent the pressure? And secondly, do we have a figure about tenants under occupying, and can you tell us about the process in place to identify them? My third actual question is actually, I'm echoing Councillor Crawford, but at a different angle, is about their health needs. This 6 to 10 or 6 to 12 weeks window is very important. For example, if a tenant is pregnant, or if they have complex health needs, if their delivery is due, or if their immunization plans. I mean, the health department and the primary care actually gives a priority to the vulnerable people, but are there any plans of continuation of their healthcare needs? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take the first part in terms of what are the statutory tests, and hopefully it won't bore you too much. But so when a household presents as homeless, there's 5 tests that an officer has to determine. First of all is eligibility. Are they eligible to receive support and advice and guidance from the service? Essentially, we're looking at the immigration status of the applicant. Second is we're determining are they threatened with homelessness, or are they actually homeless? Because that would then depend on what legal duty we owe to the applicant, or is it that we just need to provide some generic advice and support, etc. The third test is whether or not the household. So if you establish 1 and 2, you can then establish the first test, eligibility, and homelessness or prevention of due to be homeless. You then owe one of 2 duties. Essentially, you either own a prevention duty where we work with the household to try and prevent them from becoming homeless, or we owe them a relief duty. That's the point at which a household is there. You know, in other boroughs, they're at your front door with their bags saying, "I have nowhere to go this evening." When that happens, you then have to go on to determine, does the family have or the individual have a priority need? And the term priority need essentially is to determine, as an authority, do we have an interim duty to provide emergency accommodation to this household? You know, are we offering you accommodation this evening, or are we not? And there's many different sort of categories. There's some that are mandatory, there's some which are discretionary. The classic mandatory is you're homeless with dependent children. You know, if you turn up, you're homeless, we're satisfied of that, you're eligible and you've got dependent children, we have to provide you with emergency accommodation. Fourth test is to go on to look at, do you have a local connection to the area? So generally for homelessness is, have you resided in the borough of 6 out of the last 12 months or 3 out of the last 5 years within the borough? Slightly different rules concerning care experienced young people and asylum seekers. Asylum seekers, if whichever borough they present to is the borough of their choice. Care leavers, the rules are slightly different, but not massively. And then the next test is we look at intentionality. So usually that's the dirty word in homelessness, and which essentially means, is the household, are the household homeless because of something that they deliberately did? So, for example, the classic example would be you earn sufficient income and you just chose not to pay your rent. You use the money on something else. You were then evicted, and then so the local authority at that point may well issue you or could issue you with an intentionality decision.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks very much. Just want to come back to the cost question, which is obviously a big one for the council. Some fresh statistics from my organisation, Generation Rent. It's quite novel for me to bring into the, if you'll bear with me. Yeah, so we did a Freedom of Information request. I'm sure you may have spotted it, where we basically were asking about landlord incentives. And it turned out that the Ealing Council is the third highest council in the country in terms of the amount paid last year for incentives to landlords in order to host homeless families. So it was £2,260,000 paid out last year by Ealing Council. Just wondering, within these plans in the paper, what your take is on how do you reduce that amount of money that you need to pay in terms of landlord incentives, and also just a bit further clarification on what those incentives are buying the council when they're spending that amount of money. Thank you.
So what do those incentives buy? What we're trying to do is we're trying to secure a place within the rented sector for someone who might be within temporary accommodation. It makes more sense to pay those incentives than it does to keep someone in temporary accommodation year on, year out. And those costs are not only cashable costs, but they're also non-cashable costs. So the impact to a family, to their outcomes, to children's outcomes and education are severely impacted by people sitting in temporary accommodation. So to be able to move people into the private rented sector into a secure tenancy that they're able then to maintain is worth a lot of money at the end of the day. I think it goes to a wider point, which is a lot of the points that Sam was alighting on in terms of the system, the perfect storm that we find ourselves within at this moment in time, where over the last 30, 40 years, we haven't built enough homes. We haven't had enough affordable homes coming through the system. And then we've had a real acute pressure, into a cost pressure for families, which means that you are not the type of people you see coming through the door aren't the type of people that used to be coming through the door. You're seeing working families coming through the door who can no longer afford to live within Ealing. So that cost pressure is some of the cost pressures you're seeing in terms of the incentives that are coming out at the other end. How do we try and solve that? Well, Ealing's not going to solve this on its own. London's not going to solve this on its own. It takes national policy contacts to try and deliver some of that, to increase the supply of affordable homes. Ealing is doing things within that to try and manage that. So you go back to the council plans, you go back to the outcomes that were set at the beginning of this council plan, and then you look at some of the targets were set in terms of increasing the supply of affordable housing within Ealing, in terms of council new build within Ealing, trying to manage people who are being evicted in the private renter sector and trying to work them the 4,000 affordable homes target within that, sets out what Ealing can do within its context, but it really needs to go back to that wider policy agenda.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, just a quick question about that level of cost though within that wider policy agenda. I wonder if it's the council's view that reducing that cost in terms of landlord incentives would be a key part of what an effective policy looks like in terms of housing.
I think it comes back down to that. So it comes back down to that property strategy and thinking about your supply of homes and thinking about how you diversify that supply of homes. We've become very reliant upon the private rented sector, which is shrinking, which means it costs more. So we need to look towards other products that might be on the market. So that might be looking at pension funds, for example, that might be looking at other institutional investors, that might be looking towards commercial registered social landlords who are doing it for profit rather than not for profit. it will be looking at about continue to increase our supply of council new build, about our RPs in the sector, about best use of our own council stock. So if you try and diversify your supply, you're not reliant upon one segment. If you're not reliant upon one segment, you're not putting all your money into that area.
Thank you. And then a final, sorry,
Yeah.
final question. This is my very last one, I think, which is related, but not, it's quite a practical one, actually. It's about the budget and the way it's budgeted. So it says in your paper at 5.2, I think it was, that 4.2 million pounds was the predicted overspend at the start of the year. I'm just wondering, and this will help me, I think, and hopefully the panel, in terms of thinking about how the council does budgeting. Why is there a predicted overspend on a budget at the very start of the year? Why isn't there realistic budgeting going into the year, or is the plan always to reduce that overspend by the end of the year down to zero?
I think a tremendous amount of effort went into the budget setting cycle this time around, and the council has increased the TA budget significantly over that period of time, matched also by, or not matched, accompanied by additional homeless prevention grant coming into it as well. I think our challenge is that the exposure to the private rented sector and the increases that were happening at that moment in time. So when we did our budgeting exercise, we did that in November. At that time, we brought ourselves to where we thought we would be at a zero budget. Since after that period of time, that the inflation in terms of the costs for units and some of the switches that we had from private leased to nightly products pushed up the cost. There were some within there, some of the mitigations that we expected to achieve last year to reduce the budget that didn't quite come true. So all of that took us to a position where we started with a 4.2 million overspend.
Thank you, Councillor Brett.
Sorry, I just wanted to say, kind of on that budget kind of position, you know, and to reassure the panel here that we analyse and scrutinise that internally a lot, and we have a monthly meeting also with the Chief Financial Officer and Councillor Donnelly, who is in charge of our finances, and we look at all of that, and we look at what the mitigations are to make sure that that, you know, that officers are looking at all ways to reduce the cost and reduce the overspend. But I mean, as you can see in this report, there are some kind of unprecedented circumstances that have happened, particularly in the last 18 months, that have really seen that kind of, you know, skyrocket. You know, as you know, Stephen said, you know, it was an overspend of, you know, over 4 million one year to 15 million the next year. I mean, you know, that's not a sustainable position, and that is why we're looking at all options are on the table in terms of making sure, one, that we're, you know, alleviating the homelessness problem, and making sure people are not always constantly in temporary accommodation and finding them settled accommodation, but also, you know, as a council, we also have to be fiscally sound and make sure that we are, you know, we're being holding ourselves to account, but also being a responsible council in terms of taxpayers' money. So,
Thank you. Yes. I'll just ask my questions, then I'll come to you. You mentioned that the type of people that are coming through our doors is different to what we've seen before, and you know, you're getting a lot of working families and stuff. And I'm just curious to know, what is the income threshold for someone that presents as homeless? Like, is there a income threshold that we have? And I think I've got the main part. That wasn't my original question, but the other part of my question is that Section 6.9, there are three sections that is zero on the figures. Is that zero because it's truly zero, or we just didn't have the figure to put in?
So on the latter point, they're correct. On the first point, in terms of income threshold, there is no income threshold in terms of if someone presents, then we have to offer advice and support and guidance depending if they're eligible, etc. Although sort of goes without saying, the higher the income, the easier it is for us then to move them on and to try and find alternative accommodation. But there's no set income in terms of people presenting through the front door.
Thank you. Councillor Martin?
I've actually found this report really difficult because I see firsthand what's happening out there, just like you guys do. And I've got to be honest, it's an incredible report and you've done an amazing job. The overspend, I agree with you. And for colleagues around the table, you know, I see it on a monthly, in fact, sometimes on a weekly basis, rents going up. Yeah, there may be clients watching this tonight and I'm sitting there trying to get them the best possible price. But at the end of the day, I've got some very good clients out there who are trying to look after those individuals that want to accommodate people in difficulties. And it is challenging. I mean, I found it really difficult to try and criticise this report, to be honest. And I suppose that's because I do see it firsthand. So I can only compliment you on what you've done and the work you've done so far. The only concern I suppose I do have is about, again, our empty properties and how quickly we can get that stock back into action more than anything else, so we can try and get these people out of bed and breakfast as quickly as possible. Look, I appreciate we haven't got the bigger accommodation, the larger accommodation, and those seem to be the ones that that seem to be of high demand at the moment, and I appreciate that's difficult. I also come back to Councillor Crawford's questions in relation to particularly families who are having to travel out of London into London, and what priority they really are given, particularly when, you know, I've got casework that's coming in where I've got children travelling 2 hours a day to school and then having to travel 2 hours back home. It's not I understand it's not a big, you know, there's not an easy solution this, and we are looking at a perfect storm, but this perfect storm has been around for certainly the 3.5 years that I've sat on this council. So I can't give you the answer, but I can only compliment you on what you've done so far. But we do, and where do these sort of, particularly the families, fit into this about 2 hours travelling to and from? I think that's one of the big things. And when we're going to get our empty stock back into the market.
So I'll pick up the families point. We shouldn't have families, particularly with children, travelling to school, regardless of age. If they're primary or secondary, travelling, you know, 2 hours one way, we'll more than happily look at those cases and see what we can do.
And picking up the void point, I think we've had quite a few challenges in terms of making sure we get our empty properties back into use, and we've had a lot of focus upon that in terms of trying to turn that around. And those empty properties are really important to us because each one of those empty voids effectively represents one person out of bed and breakfast into some sort of settled accommodation. Over the last month, 2 months, I think we can start to see an improvement in the position. I think you can start seeing those come around, certainly from my position from a temporary accommodation void situation. We've managed to move almost, I think, about 50 families matched to move out of our leased bed and breakfast accommodation into better temporary accommodation. So, you know, it's an area that we need to keep focusing on. It's an area that we need to keep pushing. I'd just like to pick up your thanks, and also your thanks, Councillor, and I'll pass back to the teams because they do work tremendously hard, and sometimes it can feel like a bit of a thankless task.
Councillor Taylor?
Thanks, Chair. I'm not going to criticise slightly tempered here. Well, first thing I'll say on the threshold thing, remind my very first case many years ago in Hertford Town was a millionaire's row and a family came to see me, but they were offered B&B who didn't take it up, basically. I was saying report, thank you, Stephen, for putting in the TA numbers, because the report we had last year, without putting a finer point on it, wasn't great. So we're confident on the figures now. what's presented, what's being presented is on HClick, and so we know what the actual position is in terms of numbers of households. But the other question was in terms of use of homeless prevention grant, because the government condition now, or they wanted us to spend, is it 49% on prevention? So what's the current ratio as it is? How much we spend on prevention? Was it less than 49% and we spend the rest on TA?
So in terms of the ratio, the ratio's been, it was around for a little bit of time. We're spending to the ratio at the moment, and it takes a little bit of time to match the monies to the right place. We're doing that. I think the real challenge that we need to get to is, and I think again Sam alluded to this at the beginning of the session, is we need to be able to focus on the prevention piece, and we need to be spending the money on the prevention, because that gives a better outcome to the household and a better outcome to the council. In terms of the figures within the report, we are working on the figures. We've got a good sense in terms of what the numbers we think we've got within temporary accommodation. I think our challenge is that we've got a number of systems that don't talk to each other, and as a result, it becomes difficult to correlate some of that data. We've got a HIDP program, an IT program effectively, which is looking about modernising our systems and making the data better for us. And that will help us drive underneath those numbers to make sure we're absolutely certain in terms of the data that we're getting and what that's telling us.
So I'm not going to put you on the spot in terms, well, maybe I am, but is your gut feeling that it might be more or less?
I feel it's broadly right. So when you look at if you look at the trends, so our challenge is not the fact we don't have the data, the fact the data doesn't correlate to each other. So we track the number of placements that we put into temporary accommodation on a weekly basis, so we know what's going in. We can almost find the numbers that are going out, but it's in different systems. We know how many rent accounts we've got set up. We know how many rent accounts are coming through the system. We know how many properties that we pay for from the finance system. Our challenge is each of those different systems don't talk to each other, which means that you spend more time trying to put the data together to work out what it means than you do working from that data. And so the IT program is solving that by bringing it all into one place, so we have a holistic view of people who sit within temporary accommodation, which makes decision making easier.
And I think on that point, this was going to be my next question, the issue of the data cleanse 5.6 of the report. This is something we looked at last year, and we were told that, oh, we're hoping by December last year, the new system will be implemented, everything will work together, we will have the numbers, it will work. It's a year on, and we're still talking about it's what seems to be an imaginary system, to be honest. So it does, you know, like, this is the 21st century. Like, why are we still not, like, it's still not synced together? But anyway, is there a timeline again on when we are hoping to have this system up and sync together?
I think I share your frustration, because we need to run the system smoothly. We need to have the data in the right place. Whilst it seems like a long time since we sat here last time we were talking about those systems, a tremendous amount has happened within that period. We now do have an IT program that's been signed off for the budget associated with it, and we're developing the program that sits alongside that. To get to that, we had to do a lot of work to understand the different types of systems and the way we could make that work. So there's been a lot of legwork to get to that place. When we, you know, if you go back 4 months ago, for example, on our computer system, we had 21,000 TA properties live. We spent a lot of time to go through each of those, and we've got ourselves now to a place where we've got 3,000 on those. We've done a big data cleanse to try and get the property data right. The next bit for us is then going through each of those individual lines of the property data to make sure each of those individual records are accurate. We're going to do exactly the same then to the household data. And I think the challenge for us on the household data is quite complex. So it's not just the fact that the data on the system might not be quite right, it's also the fact that the people on the system will have changed since we took the data on. So there's multiple things that we're trying to solve at the same time. And you put that into a system whereby demand is coming through the door at quite a fast pace, and the prevention work they need to do at the same time, as well as trying to then look at your costs within the system, trying to then reduce your costs within that, trying to make sure you got the best outcomes for residents. It becomes quite complex, and sometimes it's quite easy to pull out one thread and say, why hasn't that thread worked, when you're not looking at it in its entirety.
I guess sometimes you do have to go back to the basics and start from the data cleanse would have to be from the basics up, and then for the whole system to work. Councillor Zizamos, I am very conscious of time, and I think this will be the final question. So yes.
Quality of temporary accommodation. How do you guys go out and look at the temporary accommodation before the borough pays for the temporary accommodation?
Yeah, so when we're acquiring temporary accommodation, yeah, it'll be a combination. If they're established providers that provide good quality accommodation, we won't necessarily visit everyone, but certainly we'll random spot check and go and assess and visit accommodation. But if it's a new provider, every accommodation that comes in will be visited, and compliance documents will be obtained before we take the properties on. No properties are taken on by the authority unless they're statutorily compliant, just so that we can ensure that the homes that we're offering to our households are safe.
Thank you very much. I think everyone's happy now. You asked all your questions. I mean, I've got more questions, but I'm not going to ask anyways. But so I think the purpose of this report was an update more than anything for us, and it was very helpful to understand and see the numbers. And I think it's definitely worth mentioning and celebrating what has worked and gone well from last year, which Councillor Taylor, you've pointed that last year we didn't even get the numbers that we wanted. So having had I think 747 families in non-compliant B&Bs down to 116 at the moment, that is something that we should celebrate, although we still have a long way to go. And Councillor Brett, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, it was actually just to kind of round up a little bit before you then round up the meeting, which is to acknowledge the fact that we're in a process and we're on a journey. We have come a long way, and the department has worked, and Stephen and the team have worked exceptionally hard to get us to this point. But to acknowledge as well that one child that is in bed and breakfast longer than 6 weeks or even longer than that again is one child too many, and it weighs heavily on me as the portfolio holder, and I'm sure heavily on a lot of our officers about those children and their life chances if we don't make sure that we can help those families in the longer term. And that is what, ultimately there's lots of data and presentations and, statistics in this, but ultimately it's those families and those children are the ones that we want to help, and, be assured that that is the end goal. But we do have a journey and a way to go in order to get to that point.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And obviously these figures that we see, it's not just numbers, these are actual people and families. So we do need to always bear that in mind. For me, in terms of, I do have recommendations to make. So, and I think I'm hoping the panel will agree with the data system upgrade, let's call it. Is it possible to get an update in 6 months to see where we are on that? Because I don't want to leave it for another year, and then next year's panel, we might, we don't know who's going to be here next year, and if the chair picks up on it, I don't know. But I think if we can get a 6 months update, that will be helpful for us. And I guess more transparency on the reality of what the department is doing. So I think, you know, when we had the conversation about the 105 families that are in B&Bs for longer than 6 weeks, you know, reading the report, it doesn't seem like there's any support whatsoever for them, where in reality there are different departments that come together to offer support. So I think more transparency on what is available and how the council is helping them, I think it would be good for residents to see. And that would be what I'm hoping to get. Yes, Ben.
Sorry, can I just suggest as a recommendation that we receive an update around those children who are no longer in non-compliant accommodation? I think you said the end of this calendar year was the.
Yeah.
Right. Yep. Thanks.
Yes, if we can add that onto the list as well. Is that everything? Yes, I think the room is in agreement on this. Perfect. Once again, thank you so much for the report and your time. I know how busy you are and how difficult it was to put this report together, but we very much appreciate the information, and it was very helpful. And yes, thank you. And this is the end of the meeting. I just want to remind panel members on our next meeting, which is 13th of November. And I am hoping to see you all here. Thank you very much.